The knock came with a clipboard and a smile that wasn't friendly, and the first sentence out of her mouth was an order: cut your grass or face fines, because this neighborhood doesn't tolerate chaos. I looked past her at my yard, green and alive, buzzing with bees, dotted with wildflowers, and I realized this wasn't about grass at all. It was about obedience. She wanted the lawn shaved, silent, obedient like hers. I thanked her, closed the door. ND felt something click. If she wanted less life, I would grow more. The letter arrived the next morning, stamped official, warning me that my lawn exceeded approved height and would be mowed by the HOA at my expense. No rule cited, just pressure. I read it twice, then opened the bylaws. Page after page revealed a truth hidden in plain language. Turf grass had limits, but native plant gardens were protected. Meadows were allowed. Trees were encouraged. Maintenance mattered, not conformity. I slept well that night. I began with a plan. I stopped mowing. I marked pathways. I ordered native seeds and saplings suited to the soil. Milkweed, bluestem, oak, maple. I installed signage explaining pollinator habitats and erosion control. I logged every step. Neighbors noticed immediately. Some frowned. Others asked questions. Kids crouched to watch caterpillars. Birds arrive like invitations accepted. She returned with a camera, documenting every inch, insisting this was neglect. I smiled and handed her the bylaw page, highlighted. She scoffed and promised escalation. Fine. I documented too. Photos, dates, receipts. I invited the county extension office to advise. They praised the plan and offered guidance. Authorities shifted without a sound. Weeks passed. The yard changed color, texture, sound. Wind moved through grasses like water. Shade grew where heat once baked. The HOA sent emails, vague and stern. Then quiet. A board member stopped by, curious. I explained the difference between disorder and design. He nodded. By the time the first saplings took hold, the narrative had flipped. What she called a mess had become a map of intention. And I was just getting started, because forests don't grow to spite someone. They grow to last. Emails spread through the block chat, debating property values, safety, and tradition, while I stayed calm, answering politely, citing sources, and inviting conversation. I hosted a weekend walk, offering lemonade, explaining root depth, water savings, and fire breaks. Skeptics listened. Supporters grew bolder. Someone brought cookies. Another offered mulch. Momentum is quiet, but it accumulates. When people see care instead of defiance, fear loosens. That was the moment I knew the forest would outgrow the complaint. Change rarely announces itself loudly. It settles in, patient, persistent, rooted, until opposition simply runs out entirely. The second notice arrived thicker, heavier, dressed in official language meant to intimidate. It warned of hearings, penalties, and corrective action, but still avoided specifics. I read it slowly, then placed it in a folder labeled Forest. Because this was no longer just a yard project. It was a test of how rules bend when challenged by patience and preparation. I responded with a calm email, attaching citations, photos, and an updated maintenance plan. No insults. No emotion. Just facts. While the HOA scrambled, the land kept working. Seeds sprouted unevenly, as nature prefers. Clover filled gaps, fixing nitrogen. Bees multiplied. Butterflies returned in numbers I hadn't seen in years. Mornings sounded different. Instead of lawnmowers, there were birds. Instead of heat shimmer, there was shade. Neighbors lingered at the fence longer now, asking what was planted where, and why she didn't like that. She began knocking on doors, warning people that my jungle would bring pests and lower values. Ironically, a local realtor shared an article showing native landscapes increasing appeal. I forwarded it to the block chat. Silence followed, then a few thumbs up. Information has a way of cooling tempers. The hearing date was set. I prepared like it mattered. Printed binders. Letters from the extension office. A statement of intent emphasizing safety, visibility, and upkeep. On the night, I arrived early. She sat across the room, arms crossed. When my turn came, I spoke plainly. This was not neglect. This was stewardship. I wasn't refusing standards. I was exceeding them in a different form. Questions followed. Fire risk, addressed with spacing and green zones. Rodents, managed through habitat balance. Sight lines, maintained along sidewalks. One board member admitted he liked the shade. Another asked about water savings. I showed numbers. The tone shifted. The vote was postponed outside. Neighbors approached. One apologized for assuming the worst. Another asked for seed sources. A third said her kids loved watching the birds. The forest was no longer just mine. It was becoming shared. The next morning, a delivery truck dropped mulch donated by a local nursery that heard about the project. I spread it with help from 2 neighbors who brought gloves and stories. We talked about summers that felt cooler, bills that felt lower, and yards that felt alive. Someone joked about turning the block into a park. We laughed, but the idea didn't leave. When the revised notice came, it was shorter. Compliance acknowledged. Conditions clarified. The word forest wasn't used, but the fight was over. Or so it seemed. Because power rarely concedes quietly. It waits. And I knew the next challenge wouldn't be about grass at all. It would be about control. Dressed up as concern, knocking again when roots were deeper and expectations had changed. The next challenge arrived disguised as friendliness. She waved one morning, clipboard gone, smile practiced. She complimented the flowers, asked about the birds, then casually mentioned uniformity. The word landed heavier than it sounded. Uniformity was the HOA's favorite disguise for control. She suggested a committee review, just to ensure everyone stayed on the same page. I nodded, thanked her, and kept planting. By now, the forest had structure. Tall natives created a canopy. Shrubs led beneath. Ground cover stitched it all together. It wasn't wild chaos. It was intentional design. I labeled plants with small wooden markers. Educational. Transparent. Hard to attack. Kids stopped to read them on walks. Parents followed. Conversations grew. The committee request became formal. A walkthrough was scheduled. I prepared again. Not defensively, but proudly. I invited a local ecologist, who happened to live 2 streets over. She volunteered to join, curious about the buzz. On inspection day, the board arrived with measuring tapes and skeptical faces. The ecologist arrived with a smile and data. She explained how native systems work, how root depth prevents erosion, how diversity reduces pests, how monoculture lawns cost more and give less. She spoke calmly, answering questions before they hardened into objections. The board listened. One took notes. Another asked about grants. The tone shifted again, but this time publicly. She tried interrupting, raising concerns about snakes and unkempt vibes. The ecologist countered with statistics and photos. Snakes avoid human activity. Managed forests aren't messy. They're resilient. Neighbors gathered, drawn by the unusual side of authority being educated instead of obeyed. The air felt lighter afterward. The board thanked everyone and promised to review guidelines. Days later, a draft update circulated. Allowances for native landscaping, reduced lawn requirements, optional conversion plans. My yard wasn't singled out. It was referenced as an example. That mattered. The backlash came quietly. Anonymous complaints. Side comments about mosquitoes. A photo posted online claiming neglect. I responded once, publicly, with evidence and an offer for a guided walk. The comments stopped. Silence can be defeat wearing patience. Then something unexpected happened. A neighbor 2 houses down removed half a lawn. Another planted milkweed. Someone started a compost share. The block began changing, not in rebellion, but in confidence. The forest had given permission. She avoided eye contact now. Power had shifted, and she knew it. Control relies on isolation. Once people compare notes, the spell breaks. I didn't celebrate. I kept tending. Growth needs maintenance, even when it's winning. Late one afternoon, a letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from the city. They wanted to feature the yard in a sustainability newsletter. I smiled, thinking of that first warning taped to my door. Cut your grass, they said. I grew a forest. And now it was teaching others how to stand their ground without raising their voice. Recognition changes things. Once the city feature went live, the forest stopped being a neighborhood oddity and became a point of pride. People drove slowly past. Some stopped to take photos. A few knocked to ask questions. I answered them all, because visibility is protection. The more eyes that understand something, the harder it is to quietly erase it. That's when the HOA tried a different angle. Not enforcement. Insurance. A new notice warned about. Liability exposure. Vague but ominous. Falling branches. Allergies. Wildlife interactions. It was fear dressed in paperwork. I read it carefully and smiled, because fear collapses fastest under preparation. I requested specifics. They couldn't give them. I contacted my insurer and had the property assessed. The result came back cleaner than expected. Native trees rated lower risk than ornamental ones. Reduced water runoff lowered flood exposure. Shade reduced heat stress. I forwarded the assessment to the board with a simple note. Reviewed. No changes needed. No argument. No apology. Meanwhile, the forest matured. The canopy thickened just enough to cool the sidewalk. The understory bloomed in waves, colors changing with the weeks. Kids built fairy houses at the edge. A retired neighbor brought a bench. It became a pause point, a place where people slowed down. Lawns don't invite lingering. Forests do. She reappeared at a community event, this time flanked by 2 board members. Her tone was careful. She asked if I'd consider guidelines to prevent others from going too far. I asked what too far meant. She couldn't define it. One board member suggested workshops instead. Education over enforcement. She didn't like that, but she nodded. The workshop filled fast. I didn't lead it alone. Neighbors shared their conversions, small and large. The ecologist returned. The city sent pamphlets. Questions replaced complaints. People realized they weren't breaking rules. They were rewriting expectations together. A month later, the HOA voted. Updated standards passed. Native landscapes approved by default. Fines eliminated for lawn height if maintenance plans existed. The language mattered. It shifted power from punishment to process. She voted no. It didn't matter. After the meeting, she approached me alone. No clipboard. No smile. Just tired. She said she was trying to keep order. I told her order isn't the same as control. Sometimes it's agreement. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. That evening, I watered saplings as the sun dipped low. The forest whispered in the breeze, leaves brushing like applause. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about permanence. Roots had set, in soil and in policy. What started as defiance had become precedent. And precedent is hard to undo. Still, I knew better than to think it was finished. Power doesn't vanish. It adapts. And the final test wouldn't come from rules or letters. It would come from something personal, something meant to make me doubt the whole thing. That was coming next. The pushback finally turned personal. One morning, a handwritten note appeared on my door. No letterhead. No signature. Just a warning about kids getting hurt and you being responsible. It wasn't official, but it was deliberate. Fear works best when it sounds like concern. I stood there holding the paper, listening to the birds, and realized this was the moment the story would either shrink or finish strong. That afternoon, I did the opposite of hiding. I hosted an open walk. Neighbors, parents, kids, even a few skeptics showed up. We talked through the paths, the clear sightlines, the non-toxic plants. I explained why nothing poisonous was planted near the sidewalk, why branches were trimmed above head height, why maintenance mattered as much as growth. Questions came. Answers followed. Fear faded in daylight. A week later, a kid scraped a knee running too fast. Not in my yard. On a concrete driveway. His parents laughed it off. No notes. Appeared. No calls were made. Reality has a way of undoing imagined threats. By then, the forest had become routine. That's the real victory. When something stops being debated and starts being normal. The HOA stopped sending notices altogether. The board moved on to parking disputes and paint colors. My yard wasn't a headline anymore. It was just part of the neighborhood. One evening, I found her standing at the edge of the property. She didn't speak at first. She watched a pair of birds hop between branches. Then she asked, quietly, how long it took. I told her the truth. Longer than you expect. Shorter than you fear. She nodded, thanked me, and left. The seasons turned. Leaves fell, then returned. The forest proved it could rest and rise again. Neighbors followed suit, some a little, some a lot. The block cooled in summer. Water bills dropped. Kids learned plant names instead of lawn schedules. Control gave way to care sometimes. I think back to that first notice, taped crookedly to my door. Cut your grass. Simple order. Easy to obey. But obedience wouldn't have changed anything. Growth did. Quiet, patient, rooted growth. I didn't grow a forest to make a point. I grew it because land remembers how to be alive when you let it. The lesson wasn't about grass or rules. It was about choosing depth over appearance, substance over silence, and in the end, the forest didn't just stay. It belonged. Peace never announces itself. It sneaks in quietly, and that's when you know something else is coming. Months after the last complaint, the HOA introduced a community improvement initiative. The language sounded friendly, but the timing felt familiar. They wanted to standardize curb appeal, encourage participation, and showcase model properties. My yard was mentioned again, politely this time, as inspiration. Inspiration is flattering, but it can also be a leash. They invited me to join the planning group. I agreed, because refusing would turn suspicion into rumor. At the first meeting, the tone was cooperative, but the goal was clear. They wanted to package the forest, turn it into a template, a controlled version that could be approved, replicated, and limited. Wildness with boundaries. I listened more than I spoke. I realized then that success creates a new risk. When something works, people try to own it. The forest had survived opposition, but now it faced appropriation. I didn't want it frozen into rules that stripped out flexibility. Nature doesn't thrive under rigid checklists. I proposed an alternative. Instead of strict standards, create principles. Safety, maintenance, native priority, education. Let homeowners interpret them creatively. Some board members hesitated. Principles are harder to police. That's exactly why they matter. Control wants measurements. Communities need trust. Debates stretched over weeks. Emails flew. Drafts changed. She pushed for tighter language, minimum trims, height caps. I countered with evidence and testimonials from neighbors who had converted small sections successfully. Momentum leaned my way, but not without cost. Compromise always asks for something. In the final version, principles won, but with review periods. Not perfect, but workable. The forest remained alive, not locked behind diagrams. The vote passed. Applause followed, genuine this time. I felt relief, not triumph. This wasn't about winning arguments anymore. It was about keeping space open. Afterward, several neighbors approached with ideas. A shared pollinator corridor. A seasonal planting day. The forest was no longer a single yard. It was becoming connective tissue. That was the part no rulebook could anticipate. Later that night, walking the paths alone, I thought about how easily this could have gone differently. If I'd yelled. If I'd ignored notices. If I'd tried to embarrass instead of explain. The forest taught patience by demanding it. Trees don't rush to prove a point. They just grow. The next phase wouldn't be about defense. It would be about responsibility. Once people follow your example, you owe them clarity. And that realization carried its own weight. The first time someone called my yard the forest, I laughed. The second time, I corrected them. By the 10th, I accepted it. Names stick when they describe something people recognize. And by then, recognition had turned into expectation. Neighbors asked when certain plants bloomed, where the birds nested, how to keep sections thriving through drought. The forest had become a reference point, and that meant it needed consistency without rigidity. I started documenting everything. Not for the HOA, but for the community. Simple guides. What survived heat waves? What failed quietly? What attracted life and what just looked nice? I shared it freely, because knowledge prevents myth. When people understand something, they protect it instead of fearing it. That transparency changed the tone of conversations. Instead of complaints, there were questions. Instead of warnings, there were suggestions. Someone proposed a shared toolshed. Another offered to map sunlight patterns. The project expanded without expanding my control over it. That mattered. This wasn't my forest anymore. It was an idea moving through different yards, adapting. She watched all of this from a distance. No interference. No endorsements. Just observation. Power doesn't like losing relevance, but it likes being seen as reasonable even more. One afternoon, she approached with a clipboard again, but this time it was blank. She asked if I'd review a draft for a welcome packet explaining the new landscaping principles to incoming residents. I agreed. Reading it, I saw traces of the old language softened but still present. Warnings framed as guidance. I revised gently, removing fear-based phrasing, replacing it with purpose. Why we do this. What it supports. How to succeed. She accepted most of the edits without comment. That told me everything. The forest kept teaching its quiet lessons. That growth can be deliberate without being aggressive. That resistance doesn't always look like refusal. Sometimes it looks like patience stretched over time. That rules are easier to change when you make them unnecessary. One evening, a storm rolled through hard and fast. Wind bent branches. Rain pulled and drained cleanly into the soil. The next day, lawns nearby were torn and muddy. The forest stood steady. People noticed. Resilience isn't dramatic. It's visible afterward. At the next HOA meeting, a board member referenced forest-style landscaping as a strength of the community. Not an exception. A strength. Applause followed, unprompted. She didn't clap, but she didn't object. Walking home, I realized something important had shifted. The story was no longer about defiance. It was about identity. The neighborhood had changed how it saw itself. And once identity changes, enforcement loses its edge, but stories don't end when conflicts resolve. They end when lessons settle. The forest was still growing. So was the understanding around it. And there was one final moment coming, one that would confirm whether this change was surface level or rooted for good. The final test arrived quietly, as all real tests do. A developer approached the HOA with a plan to build a small subdivision nearby. They wanted uniformity, predictability, and lawns instead of native gardens. Meetings were scheduled. Maps circulated. The same arguments about aesthetics, control, and property values resurfaced, like ghosts of the first complaint. Everyone looked to me, the forest yard, as an example, or a threat. I prepared differently this time. No binders, no citations. Just the story. How a single yard had survived opposition, grown wildlife, taught neighbors, and inspired careful, intentional landscaping. I walked board members and neighbors through the timeline, highlighting measurable benefits. Lower water use, less mowing, improved pollinator habitats, and community engagement. The message was simple. Flexibility produces results. Fear produces resistance. They listened. They asked questions. And slowly, what started as opposition turned into curiosity. Could these principles scale? Could they improve the new development instead of limit it? I suggested workshops, seasonal evaluations, and optional planting guidelines. Nothing mandatory, everything advisory. Real power doesn't demand compliance. It invites collaboration outside. She watched, clipboard finally empty. No protests. No warnings. She had learned, whether consciously or not, that control diminishes when people understand, participate, and benefit. Influence becomes irrelevant when respect takes its place. The vote came. Guidelines passed. Native landscaping recommended. No mandatory height limits. The forest had proven its point not just for one yard, but as a principle for the entire block. Cheers quietly spread among neighbors. The developer nodded, impressed. For once, success wasn't about opposition, it was about impact. That night, I walked through the yard, the forest alive with soft sounds of leaves rustling and birds nesting. The pathways were shaded, the flowers bright, the canopy protective. Each plant, each tree, had survived complaints, weather, and skepticism. Each had become part of a larger story. That persistence paired with patience produces change stronger than rules enforced by fear. I realized then the truth I had been living. This was never about cutting grass. It was about standing for life, complexity, and beauty even when someone demanded simplicity. Growth is stubborn, but it rewards those willing to nurture it over time. From that moment forward, the forest became more than a yard. It became a symbol. A reminder that careful resistance isn't loud or aggressive. It's intentional, steady, and rooted deep enough that even storms and skeptics can't erase it. By now, the forest had become part of daily life, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. Children raced along winding paths, stopping to examine butterflies and ladybugs. Neighbors shared tools and seeds, swapping tips about soil and sunlight. The HOA's perspective shifted quietly. What was once a problem yard was now a point of pride, a model for thoughtful landscaping. Even skeptics stopped by occasionally, curious rather than critical. The original complainer, Karen, had become a silent observer. She no longer approached with threats or warnings. Her influence waned as engagement and education grew. Control loses momentum when it isn't met with fear. It dissipates in the light of collective participation. That lesson, I realized, was more valuable than any bylaw or citation. One morning, a reporter from the local newspaper arrived, drawn by stories of the yard that became a forest. They wandered through, notebook in hand, photographing the canopy, the flower beds, the small pond with frogs croaking in harmony. Interviews captured neighbors' voices, describing the benefits of shade, pollination, and community gatherings. I shared the journey, from a simple complaint to a thriving ecosystem. The reporter smiled and promised the article would highlight resilience, stewardship, and growth. The exposure brought more visitors, students from the Oakville High School came for biology projects, a gardening club scheduled monthly workshops, and even city officials stopped by to discuss sustainability incentives. The forest had outgrown me. It had become a community resource. And yet, every plant, every branch, every path reminded me that the fight began with a single complaint about grass. Through it all, I maintained the forest's integrity. Paths remained clear, plants healthy, wildlife undisturbed. Maintenance wasn't a chore, it was a continuation of the story, a reminder that patience, persistence, and proper planning outshine shortcuts and quick compliance. The forest wasn't rebellion, it was thoughtful creation. Late one evening, as the sun set behind the tallest oaks, I walked slowly through the yard. Leaves brushed softly against my hands, a gentle reminder that life, nurtured with intention, thrives beyond expectation. The neighborhood had changed because of it. The HOA had changed because of it. And I had changed because of it. What started as a simple conflict over grass had grown into something enduring, a living lesson in patience, planning, and the power of resilience. And while Karen's complaints faded, the forest remained, growing quietly but undeniably, a testament to what's possible when persistence meets care. The final chapter of this journey wasn't marked by conflict or confrontation. It was marked by celebration. Neighbors began organizing seasonal events in the forest: spring planting days, summer pollinator workshops, and autumn nature walks. The yard had transformed from a personal stand into a shared experience, a place where learning and life intertwined. What was once a battleground became a community hub. Karen didn't attend any of the events, but she no longer approached with complaints. Her silence spoke louder than words. Influence relies on others' attention. When attention shifts to collaboration and growth, resistance becomes irrelevant. I realized then that the forest had accomplished more than I imagined. It had shifted culture, rewritten expectations, and invited engagement without coercion. Local schools contacted me to bring small groups for environmental lessons. Families came for weekend walks. The city even asked if it could feature the forest in their sustainability program, highlighting the yard as a model for native landscaping, wildlife support, and community engagement. Recognition validated the effort, but it also reminded me that change is contagious when rooted in intention. Through every season, I maintained the forest carefully. Pathways cleared, plants trimmed where necessary, wildlife nurtured, and volunteers welcomed. The key wasn't perfection. It was consistency, visibility, and education. Children learned that care produces life, neighbors learned that patience produces understanding, and the HOA learned that compliance isn't the same as creativity. Looking back, it's almost impossible to remember the first warning taped to my door: cut your grass. Such a simple order. Yet, that order sparked something far greater than compliance. It sparked vision, patience, and community. The forest wasn't just a yard anymore. It was a living story, teaching lessons of persistence, planning, and quiet defiance through growth. And the most powerful lesson? Growth, when nurtured properly, can't be contained by rules or fear. It spreads, it adapts, and it inspires. From one complaint about a simple lawn, the neighborhood had learned how to respect diversity, how to value life in all its forms, and how patience can turn resistance into opportunity. The sun set over the tallest trees, casting long shadows across pathways lined with flowers and buzzing with pollinators. I walked slowly, taking in the sights, the smells, the life thriving in what once was just grass. And in that moment, I knew the forest would endure, not because of me, not because of rules, but because it had been allowed to grow. The first warning was gone, the complaints were gone, but the forest remained. And it always would. If you loved this story of patience, persistence, and HOA victory, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more viral HOA Karen tales that backfire.